The rain poured heavily outside as the bartender, Jimmy, wiped down the counter. His small-town bar, the Oak Tavern, was usually quiet, but tonight felt different. Thunder rolled in the distance as the door creaked open. Everyone in the bar turned to look at the figure standing there. He was tall, with a weathered face that seemed familiar. His boots clunked against the wooden floor as he walked in, carrying an air of authority. Jimmy squinted, but couldn't place him. The man sat down at the bar, removed his drenched cowboy hat, and ordered a whiskey. Jimmy hesitated. Something about the man's presence was both intriguing and intimidating. Before he could pour the drink, a murmur ran through the bar. A young waitress whispered, "Jimmy, don't you know who that is? That's Clint Eastwood." Jimmy chuckled nervously. "Nah, can't be. Why would someone like him come here?" But the man's piercing gaze met Jimmy's, and it was as if time froze. For reasons Jimmy couldn't explain, he decided not to serve him. "Sorry, sir," Jimmy said firmly. "I think you've had enough for tonight." The room fell silent. Clint leaned back and said calmly, "Well, that's a first." The bar patrons exchanged uneasy glances. Jimmy's heart pounded as Clint Eastwood studied him with an unreadable expression. "You refusing service to me?" Clint asked, his voice low but steady. Jimmy swallowed hard. "It's not personal," he replied. "I have a policy about serving anyone who seems off." Clint smirked, tapping his fingers on the counter. "Interesting policy," he said. "You've got guts, kid. Most people wouldn't dare." Jimmy felt a mix of relief and fear. He couldn't tell if Clint was impressed or offended. The rain outside grew heavier, and the bar seemed to shrink under the weight of the moment. One of the regulars, a retired schoolteacher named Martha, spoke up. "Jimmy, maybe you should—" "No," Clint interrupted, his voice sharp. "Let the boy stick to his rules." The tension was unbearable. People whispered, unsure of what would happen next. Jimmy stood his ground, but his palms were sweaty. He thought about his late father, who had taught him to always trust his instincts. "I'm just doing my job," Jimmy said, his voice steady but soft. Clint's eyes softened for a brief moment, and he nodded. "Fair enough," he said. "But let's see where this leads." Jimmy tried to focus on serving other customers, but the weight of Clint's presence loomed over the bar. The actor sat quietly, occasionally glancing around. He seemed unbothered, but there was a flicker of something deeper in his eyes, something Jimmy couldn't place. A man in the corner finally spoke. "Clint, why'd you come to a place like this?" Clint leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "I came here because it reminds me of where I started," he said. "Before the fame, before Hollywood." The bar grew even quieter. People leaned in, curious. "I wasn't always a star," Clint continued. "I was just a kid, working odd jobs, trying to make ends meet. Places like this? They were home to me." Jimmy felt a pang of guilt. Maybe he'd misjudged Clint. But before he could say anything, Clint looked directly at him. "You see, kid? Sometimes it's the small-town folks who teach you the biggest lessons." Jimmy's chest tightened. He didn't know what to say. The room was heavy with emotion, and a few patrons dabbed their eyes. As Clint's words hung in the air, Jimmy realized this was more than just a bar confrontation. It was a moment he'd never forget. Jimmy couldn't shake the weight of Clint's words. The bar felt quieter than ever, and every creak of the old wooden floor seemed louder. Clint sat there, calm but unreadable, as though he carried the weight of decades on his shoulders. Jimmy thought of his father, who used to sit in the same corner booth sharing stories of his struggles and triumphs. His father had always told him, "Son, every man you meet has a story that could break your heart if you knew it." But Jimmy hadn't thought much about those words, until tonight. Clint finally spoke again, his voice low and steady. "You remind me of someone I once knew?" The words startled Jimmy. "Who?" he asked, his curiosity piqued. "My father," Clint replied, his eyes distant. "He was a simple man like you. Worked hard, didn't take nonsense from anyone. He taught me to stand up for what's right, no matter who you're up against." Jimmy's throat tightened. He wanted to ask more, but felt his voice might betray him. As Clint stared into his empty glass, he added softly, "But standing tall comes with a price, kid. It always does." Jimmy hesitated, but couldn't hold back. "What do you mean by a price?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Clint leaned forward, resting his elbows on the counter. "Sometimes, when you stand for something, you lose things. People, even. I learned that the hard way." The bar was silent. Even the regulars who usually laughed and drank loudly sat still, their attention glued to the conversation. "I lost my father when I was barely 20, Clint admitted. "He was gone before he ever saw me make something of myself." Jimmy's chest tightened. He thought of his own father, who had passed away just a year ago. They'd built the bar together, and Jimmy still kept his father's favorite pen in the cash register as a reminder. Clint reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an old, weathered envelope. "I've carried this letter for over 60 years, he said. "It was the last thing my father gave me." Jimmy froze as Clint slid the envelope across the counter. The words, "To my son, Clint," were written in neat handwriting. Clint's voice cracked as he said, "Sometimes I wonder if I've lived up to what he hoped for." Jimmy stared at the letter, his hands trembling. "You never opened it?" he asked, his voice shaky. Clint shook his head. "No. I was too scared. I thought, what if it said something I wasn't ready to hear? What if it told me I'd disappointed him?" The bar grew even quieter. Martha, the retired teacher, wiped a tear from her cheek. A younger patron, barely old enough to drink, leaned forward as if drawn into the gravity of Clint's story. Jimmy picked up the envelope gently, as though it might crumble in his hands. "Do you want me to read it for you?" he asked softly. Clint hesitated, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. Then he nodded. "I think it's time." Jimmy carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, slightly yellowed with age. He unfolded it and began to read aloud. "My dear Clint," the letter began. Jimmy's voice broke as he continued. "I may not always be here to guide you, but I want you to know how proud I am of you. You've always had a strong heart, and I know you'll do great things." By the time Jimmy finished reading, there wasn't a dry eye in the bar. Even Clint wiped away a tear, whispering, "I needed to hear that more than I ever realized." The room was still, except for the sound of Jimmy folding the letter back into its envelope. Clint stared at the counter, his usually confident demeanor replaced by vulnerability. Jimmy cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "My dad left me something too," he said quietly. "It wasn't a letter, but he always told me one thing before he passed. Be brave enough to do what's right, even if it's hard. I guess I thought of that when I didn't serve you earlier." Clint's eyes met Jimmy's. "Your dad sounds like a wise man," Clint said, his voice thick with emotion. Jimmy nodded. "He was, and he would have been the first to tell me I was wrong tonight. I judged you before I knew you, and I'm sorry." Clint chuckled softly, a sound that felt more like a release than amusement. "Don't be. You reminded me of something important tonight, that every decision we make comes from a place of learning. You were following your gut, and that's nothing to apologize for." Martha sniffled from her seat. "Oh, Clint, you've got us all crying tonight," she said, her voice trembling. Clint gave her a warm smile, and the room filled with quiet laughter through the tears. Clint leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant. You know, he began, everyone sees the tough guy in the movies, the cowboy who never flinches, but they don't see the cost of carrying that image. Jimmy and the patrons listened intently as Clint spoke. I've lived over 90 years, he said, his voice steady. And in all that time, I've learned that the hardest battles aren't on screen. They're the ones inside us. He paused, his hands resting on the counter. There's a part of me that's always wondered if I've done enough. For my family, for myself. People think success erases all your doubts, but the truth is, it doesn't. Jimmy felt a lump in his throat. He hadn't expected the legendary Clint Eastwood to be so raw, so human. Clint continued, I've had my share of mistakes, and I've lost people along the way. My father, my mentors, my friends. It's easy to lose yourself in regret. The bar was silent, each person lost in their thoughts. Clint looked at Jimmy and said, But the one thing I've learned? It's never too late to make things right. Jimmy reached for a bottle of whiskey, his hands steady now. He poured Clint a drink and slid it across the counter. I think you've earned this, he said softly. Clint smiled, picking up the glass. Thank you, he said, his voice filled with warmth. He took a slow sip, savoring the moment. As the patrons relaxed, the atmosphere in the bar shifted. Stories began to flow, some shared by Clint, others by the regulars. Martha told Clint about her late husband, who had idolized him. He always said, If I could be half as brave as Clint Eastwood, I'd be a happy man. Clint placed his hand over hers. He sounds like a man I would have been proud to know, he said sincerely. Jimmy felt a wave of emotion as he watched the room. This wasn't just another night at the bar. It was something extraordinary. The walls seemed to echo with the shared stories of pain, resilience, and hope. As the evening drew on, Clint stood and raised his glass. To the people who make life worth living, he said. The crowd joined in that moment. It felt as though every scar and every regret had found a place to heal. As the night deepened, Jimmy noticed Clint staring at a framed photo on the wall behind the counter. It was an old picture of Jimmy's father, wearing his signature apron and beaming proudly beside a younger Jimmy. Clint pointed at it. Is that your dad? He asked. Jimmy nodded. Yeah, that's him. He built this bar with his bare hands. Said it was going to be his gift to the town. Clint smiled faintly. He looks like the kind of man who didn't back down from a challenge. Jimmy chuckled softly. That's putting it lightly. He always said this place wasn't just for drinks. It was a place for people to feel like they belonged. Clint's expression darkened, and he leaned in closer. Do you think he'd be proud of you? Jimmy froze. The question hit harder than he expected. He thought about the nights he'd spent doubting himself, wondering if he was living up to his father's legacy. I hope so, he whispered, his voice breaking. Clint nodded slowly. You're doing more than you realize. Sometimes just standing in the gap for others is enough to make someone proud. The words landed heavily, and Jimmy felt an ache in his chest he hadn't felt in years. As Clint's words lingered, Martha chimed in from her seat. Jimmy, you know your dad used to brag about you all the time, right? He'd say, that boy of mine, he's got a heart too big for this world. Jimmy's eyes welled up, and he turned away for a moment to collect himself. He said that? He asked, his voice barely audible. Martha nodded, tears glistening in her own eyes. He did. And he'd be bursting with pride if he saw you now. Clint raised his glass again. To fathers, he said, simply. The rest of the bar followed suit, their voices softer this time. Jimmy smiled through his tears. Thank you, he said. All of you. But just as the moment seemed to settle, Clint looked down at the counter and muttered something that made everyone pause. I should have told my dad that I loved him more." The weight of his confession hung in the air. Clint sighed deeply, his age showing more than ever. We get so caught up in living that we forget to say the things that matter. Jimmy's heart ached for the man in front of him. The great Clint Eastwood wasn't just a legend tonight. He was a son, like any other. The room was heavy with emotion, but Jimmy couldn't let Clint's words go unanswered. "You know," he began, "it's not too late to honor him." Clint raised an eyebrow, his curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" Jimmy gestured to the letter still resting on the counter. "You carried this for over 60 years. That means he's been with you all along, in everything you've done. I think he knows." Clint sat back, his face unreadable. For a moment, it seemed like he was lost in thought, then he gave a small nod. "Maybe you're right, kid." Martha spoke up again, her voice trembling but steady. "Clint, you've touched so many lives. Maybe that's your way of honoring him, by being the man he raised you to be." Clint looked around the room, his eyes meeting each person's gaze. "You all have a way of putting things into perspective," he said with a soft smile. "I guess even a cowboy needs a little guidance sometimes." The bar erupted in gentle laughter, a much-needed release after the intense emotions. But as the night wore on, Jimmy knew this wasn't just a regular shift. It was a moment that would change all their lives. The laughter faded, and Clint gazed at the letter resting on the counter. His hand trembled as he reached for it. Jimmy noticed, but he said nothing, letting the silence do the talking. Clint opened his mouth to speak, but his voice caught. It was as if the words he had carried for decades were suddenly too heavy. "You know," he finally said, his voice quiet. "My dad used to call me a dreamer. Said I could do anything if I worked hard enough." His lips twitched into a faint smile. "But I don't think I ever told him he was the reason I believed that." Jimmy felt his throat tighten again. "He sounds like a man who gave you all he had," he said softly. Clint nodded. "He did. He taught me how to work with my hands, how to stand up for myself, how to see people for who they really are." He paused. "But I was so focused on proving I could make it in the world, I forgot to thank him for it." Martha's voice broke the silence. "Maybe that's why you've touched so many lives, Clint. Maybe you've been paying it forward all along." Just as the conversation settled, the bar door creaked open. A tall man stepped in, his face weathered and familiar. For a moment, Jimmy thought he'd seen a ghost. "Mr. Eastwood?" the man asked, his voice hesitant. Clint turned, his eyes narrowing as if trying to place the man. Then recognition dawned. "Timmy?" he said, standing up. The room buzzed with curiosity. Timmy, as it turned out, was the son of one of Clint's oldest friends, a man who had passed away decades ago. "I've been looking for you," Timmy said, his voice cracking. "My dad told me stories about you, how you helped him when he'd nothing." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a photograph. It showed Clint and Timmy's father standing beside an old truck, their smiles wide and proud. Clint's face softened. "Your dad, he was one of the good ones," he said. "I never forgot him." Timmy's eyes glistened. "He never forgot you either. He always said you were the brother he never had." The bar fell silent again, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone. Clint's eyes grew misty as he took the photograph, holding it as though it were a piece of his own history. The photograph sparked a flood of memories for Clint. He sank back into his chair, the weight of years catching up to him. "Your dad was there when I needed a friend the most," Clint said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We were just kids trying to figure out the world, but he had a way of making it feel like everything would be okay." Timmy smiled sadly. "He used to say the same thing about you. Said you gave him hope when things got hard." Jimmy watched the exchange, feeling the room shift again. This wasn't just about Clint anymore. It was about the connections people carry through time, the ways lives intertwine and leave marks long after we're gone. Clint placed the photo on the counter and turned to Jimmy. "Your dad would have liked him," he said. He had that same fire. Jimmy felt his chest tighten, his emotions threatening to overwhelm him. "I think he would have liked you too," he replied. As the night wore on, the stories continued, weaving together the past and the present. For the first time in years, Clint felt something he hadn't in a long time: peace. The bar was quieter now, the energy soft but electric. Clint sat with Timmy on one side and Jimmy on the other, the photograph still lying on the counter like a relic of the past. "Funny how life works," Clint said, breaking the silence. "You try to run from your ghosts and they end up finding you anyway." Timmy nodded. "I don't think they're ghosts, though. I think they're reminders of who we are and where we come from." Jimmy, who had been cleaning a glass just to keep his hands busy, set it down. "I think this place has seen more tears tonight than it has in years," he joked, his voice shaky but warm. Clint chuckled. "Sometimes a good cry is the best thing for the soul." He raised his glass. "To the ones we've lost, and the lessons they've left behind." Everyone in the bar lifted their glasses in unison. The clinking sound was soft, almost reverent. Some wiped away tears, while others simply stared into their drinks, lost in thought. In that moment, it wasn't just Clint Eastwood sitting in that bar. It was a man, surrounded by people who understood the weight of living and the grace of remembering. By morning, word of the night's events had spread like wildfire. Customers came in asking Jimmy, "Did Clint Eastwood really come here last night?" Jimmy smiled knowingly, but said little. He didn't want to cheapen what had happened by turning it into gossip. But the people who had been there, the regulars like Martha, the newcomers like Timmy, they couldn't stop talking about it. They spoke of Clint's honesty, his humility, and the way he carried decades of wisdom like a treasure he was finally willing to share. For Clint, the night had been a turning point. Before leaving, he'd left a note for Jimmy. "Thanks for the drink, even if it took a while to get to the good stuff. Keep this place alive. It's what the world needs." Jimmy framed the note and hung it next to his father's photo. It became a piece of the bar's history, a symbol of everything the place stood for: connection, healing, and the simple act of being human. A few weeks later, Jimmy received an envelope in the mail. Inside was a signed letter from Clint Eastwood, thanking the town for their kindness and sharing how that night had given him peace he hadn't felt in years. Jimmy read the letter aloud at the bar, his voice cracking with emotion. By the end, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. As the bar filled with applause, Jimmy looked at the photo of his dad. He whispered, "We did good, Dad." And that's how it ended. Not with fireworks, but with something deeper. A shared understanding that life, no matter how hard or fleeting, is worth living when it's shared with others. Dear viewers, if this story touched your heart, please show some love. Hit that like button, subscribe to my channel, and leave a comment sharing what this story meant to you. Let's keep creating moments that bring us together. See you in the next story.